So this month we sort of have a winner by default. Becky Harden was the only entry we had, so she's going to be our winner since nobody else is contesting her win. Now, a dramatic reading of Grocery Shopping Chrononaut Style. Looking out the kitchen window, Steve sips freshly brewed coffee, enjoying his morning view of Boston with all the cherry blossoms blooming. Though Steve enjoyed spending yesterday visiting Boston in 1773 for the Boston Cake Riot, he was happy to be back in his time, 2157, to see the spring foliage again. The Boston Cake Riot is exciting to watch for sure, but it was so cold and wet all that day. Steve is a chrononaut who spends his days traveling through time with the use of a wristwatch-sized time machine he acquired from his father, Gunther, who was also a chrononaut until he retired the day Steve turned 18. The production of time-traveling watches began in 1932. A company, known as Einstein Industries, was experimenting with time travel. By 1996, they had invented the wristwatch-sized time machine. Soon, every wealthy person in the country owned one. Needless to say, selling time machine devices had disastrous effects. To repair the damage, an elite force was established to confiscate and destroy all civilian-owned time machines. This team of elites was called Chronocops. Steve's grandfather, Christoph, was one of them. With the job complete, Chronocops were ordered to turn in and destroy their time machines as well. However, Christoph turned in a fake and kept the real watch. He used the wristwatch to live his childhood dream of owning a restaurant that served food from throughout the ages. He named it Cuisine of the Ages, and it wasn't long before it became a high-class restaurant. Each day, a specific dish was served, made from ingredients from different points in time. After Christoph retired, Gunther took over running the restaurant, and Steve took over his father's old position, the responsibility for obtaining the secret ingredients for each meal. Today's menu included Marie Antoinette's cake and woolly mammoth steak with a dodo bird egg omelet. Obtaining the cake was Steve's first assignment. This required clothes that matched the appearance of a royal servant from 18th century France, along with a food container small enough to hide in his jacket. Steve has an entire room in his apartment dedicated to the massive wardrobe required to do the job. After packing his apparel, Steve makes his way to the nearest teleportation device and heads to Fontainebleau, France. Once there, Steve heads to the Chateau de Fontainebleau, where in 1776, Queen Marie Antoinette and her grandiose 21st birthday party. With all the partygoers busy drinking and gambling, it's the easiest moment in history to snatch some of Marie's gâteau d'amande, otherwise known as almond cake. Not a particularly fancy dish, but give anything a fancy name and people will buy it. Bustling with tourists, Steve waits for the Turkish boudoir to become vacant. When traveling back in time for this particular occasion, Steve always uses the room to change. During Marie's 21st birthday, the Turkish boudoir is still under construction, so he knows it will be empty. After changing, Steve adjusts his wristwatch and turns back time, arriving 20 hours into the Queen's party. By this point, most party goers should be pretty wasted or distracted. Making his way to the kitchen, Steve sees servants working diligently on exhausted feet to serve the guests. From there, he grabs 3 gâteaux d'amande, placing them inside a container hidden inside his jacket. On his way out of the kitchen, he grabs a tray of drinks to serve to guests, making sure to pass the Queen her favorite drink, water from Ville d'Avray. While no one's looking, he creeps back upstairs and whooshes himself back to 2157. As he grabs his clothes to change, a woman spots him. From her attire, Steve could see she was a manager. Irritated, she walks toward him, complaining that he's made his group wait for over 15 minutes. Steve realizes she mistook him for one of the tour guides. To avoid any trouble, he apologizes and says he will get to it right away. The tour lasted over 2 hours. Once it concluded, Steve went back for his clothes, then made his way back to Boston. Back at his family's restaurant, Steve hands over the three Marie Antoinette's cakes to Gunther, who places them in a matter replicator and begins making copies. "Good job," Gunther says. "Now you only have to worry about the main course. Don't take too long," he says with a wink. Steve chuckles. No promises. Then he goes up to his room to prepare for the next journey, collecting dodo eggs. Steve knows that the best year to collect dodo eggs on Mauritius Island is during the end of the 8th century, before the island was discovered. The best location to time travel for this item is Kuripep, Mauritius, located deep enough into the island that finding dodo nests will be over easy. Wearing golfing attire and throwing a backpack over his shoulder, Steve heads back to his local teleportation station and makes his way to Karapeep in a matter of minutes. From there, he travels straight to the Dodo Club, a local golf club. After walking through the main doors, Steve heads directly for the restroom and locks himself in the first open stall he finds. He makes a few adjustments to his wristwatch and then, once again, makes his way backwards in time. Steve discovered it's best to egg hunt at night while the birds are roosting. Getting bit by an alert dodo is not an enjoyable experience. The men's room stalls at the Dodo Golf Club place him right in the middle of a bunch of dodo birds' nests. Before grabbing an egg, Steve prepares his wristwatch for the journey home. Now, all he has to do is grab and go. Quietly, kneeling down by the nearest nest, he gently plucks an egg out from under a sleeping dodo. Triumphant, Steve stood, admiring his prize for a moment before engaging the time-traveling mechanism. Steve twists and pushes the little knob in the watch to head back to his time, when, suddenly, a sharp pain pierces the back of his left ankle. The dodo whose egg he snatched was awake and exacting her revenge. The shock and pain caused him to jolt forward, nearly smashing his head into a tiled wall and almost dropping the egg into the toilet. He was back in 2157. After collecting himself, Steve takes his backpack off and places it on the floor. He pulls out a container with a cushioned interior and gently places the dodo egg inside. Carefully placing the container in his backpack, he puts the backpack over his arms and heads back to the restaurant again. Gunther places the dodo egg in the matter replicator and begins duplicating the egg to ensure he has enough to make all the omelets he needs for their customers that evening. "All right," said Gunther. "Now you just need to bring me the woolly mammoth meat. Shouldn't be too hard, right?" He chuckles. "Easy as cake." Mammoth hunting is a bit trickier than pilfering cakes from drunks or snatching eggs from sleeping birds. Luckily, Steve has a note from his last mammoth expedition that states exactly when and where he last hunted one. All he has to do is go back to that exact same time and place and take off another decent-sized chunk. This location happened to be in Lakewood Park in Lakewood, Ohio. Back into his everyday clothes with a backpack stuffed with heavy winter garments, Steve teleports to Cleveland, Ohio, and makes his way west to Lakewood. Once there, he makes his usual trip to the public restrooms, slips into his Ice Age gear, and begins a 250,000-year journey into the past. Trudging through the deep snow, Steve makes his way to the location he marked on his paper. As expected, his freshly killed mammoth was still intact. "Right where I left you," he said with a smile. Steve cuts off just what he needs and places it in his cooler bag that was smashed into the bottom of his backpack. Then he heads back to the same spot he traveled from. Otherwise, he'd end up in the middle of the Foster pool, which would be rather difficult to explain again. Back in his own time, Steve quickly changes out of his heavy clothes, shoves them into his backpack, throws his backpack over his shoulder, and takes his bounty back to the restaurant. Steve hands the meat over to Gunther, who places it in the matter replicator after removing the dodo eggs from the container. "Told you I'd be back before you were done, Dad," Steve says. With a grin, Gunther replies, "You always are." Exhausted from the day, Steve heads up to his room to shower and rest. Just another day's work of shopping for Steve the Chrononaut. So the deadline for entry is April 7th, 2023, and the word count should be somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 words. This is flash fiction after all. So go ahead, get writing, and good luck.